So let me share my screen. Okay, so can you see it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing you notice is the Amidia group, which is like El Abuelo, the grandfather of the Humanity United. It's like the parent. And then Adapt Peacebuilding, which is my organization. And the first thing is very important. You notice that they all have circles, right? So this means if you like to do systems work, then you need to have circles. So when I look at FIP, you don't have a circle there. So maybe that's something we need to change. I'm just joking. I'm just joking. So, okay. So we're going to talk about systems approaches to monitoring, evaluation, and learning. There are so many methods to do this, and we can't cover them all today. So I've sent you a lot of resources, and there are a lot of references in this PowerPoint that you can use if you want more information. We are going to focus on the methodology that is used by the Amidia group because it is compatible, it is related to the systems practice that some of you learned already, the Acumen Plus course. So some of the concepts will be familiar to you already. And I want to say also that when we think about monitoring, evaluation, and learning from a systems perspective, sometimes people don't talk about systems, they talk about complexity. No sé cómo se dice en español, complexity. Complexidad. So it is more or less the same, just for you to be aware of. So first of all, just some information about what is monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And I turn off my pointer. So it is a framework that has tools that helps you to monitor your progress, to change your programs when you learn new information, to do evaluation, to understand your impact, usually at the end of a program. It helps you to be accountable to your donors, the people that are giving you money. And it also helps you to generate learning for your use inside the organization and also outside the organization. Now, in reality, people or organizations don't use all of these functions. Sometimes people do no monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or they just do a very simple kind of evaluation, for example, because normally a donor requires some evidence that you did what you said you were going to do. So there's different range of how much work you want to apply to this practice. Now, there are a few different tools that are important for us to understand. One is called a logic model, sometimes called an outcomes hierarchy, but it is some kind of document or chart or picture or illustration that shows how the project is supposed to work. Like if we do A, we expect to see B, and then we expect to see C. So sometimes it is talked about like activities, outputs, outcomes, results. And it is like a hierarchy. to show how your program achieves its results. Do you understand?
Yes.
Okay. So an evaluation matrix, sometimes called a log frame, it is what you put that logic model into that also shows how are we going to measure the change. What questions do we need to ask? What indicators will we use to answer these questions? What sources of data will we use to have the information we require? And what methods will we use to analyze it? And then the third tool that is useful is learning products. So you might produce a report from an evaluation. You might produce some kind of graphic from your monitoring to show trends over time. You might use a systems map or a narrative to tell a story about what kind of impact you are having. The idea is that it is useful for an organization like FIP to not just use this information for your donor, but to also use it for other stakeholders because you are interested in knowledge creation. So that is the learning part of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Any questions?
No.
No.
Okay. So we are going to use this example to talk about during this session. I don't know how easy it is for you to see this, but this is a systems map from Humanity United. It is their Transforming Peacebuilding program. And this is an interesting one because we are part of this strategy. So the work that we are doing now is related to part of this map. It's related to the idea of supporting domestic actors, dynamic actors, organizations with a lot of capacity to support peace from within a country. So I want to use this example to show how they measure the performance of this Transforming Peacebuilding program. And I'll tell you just a little bit about it. It talks about the problems of the global peacebuilding system. One problem is there's so many top-down approaches that come from governments or multilateral organizations, not from the people. Another problem is that the system is often reacting to crisis. So, for example, when there is genocide or there's a huge migration of people or a large war, we respond after it happens. We're not so good at conflict prevention, at stopping the conflict. Another set of problems is that local people and organizations, they are not included very strongly sometimes. Sometimes in a peace process, it's international stakeholders that have a lot of influence. Another issue is that there's not good collaboration between stakeholders. So there's a lot of different parts of the problem of global peace building. We are going to focus on this area as an example today. And that area is about how we respond to risk, but we don't focus on preventing war before it happens. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right, great. So this thing here is a leverage hypothesis. So some of you are familiar already with what this is. These things, they show what Humanity United plans to do to change this system. So some of you in your mapping processes already have started to think about what would we do? And it is a logic model. For example, they believe that by creating capacities for driving peace from within a country, they can build a demand for reform that fixes the fear that many organizations have about failure, and it fixes this idea to have just quick solutions. I know that's hard to understand without all of the detail here, but I just try to give you an overview. Another strategy for them is that they want to support this bright spot here, this positive part of the peace building system, which is that a lot of organizations are recognizing that we need to be better at responding to conflict before it happens, not after it happens, because it's a lot cheaper to prevent war than it is to clean it up, and it's a lot better for people. So their strategy is also about trying to support that. So can you see how that provides an intervention logic? It says they're going to do these things and they expect to have these impacts in the system.
Sorry, Steven, when you're talking about impacts, you mean correlations between the categories?
We're talking about the action that they want to take, and so their activity and the outcome that they expect it to have. And as we go through the presentation, you will see that from a systems approach, it goes much further. So it looks at what you do, and it looks at what we say in English, first order effects, second order effects, third order effects. And there are other terms that I will introduce, ripple, spread, and they explain how we go from our action to systemic change. So yeah, bear with me and I will answer your question a bit more in future slides.
Okay.
So this is what a log frame looks like from a systems perspective. I'm not going to show you, go into detail now, but just to show you, like you would have a log frame for traditional M&E, but in systems practice, you have a lot more layers of information that you collect. So we will focus on that a little bit more in the rest of the presentation. Okay, so some kind of overall comments about a systems approach to monitoring and evaluation and what is different. Now, the first one is that we are trying to measure the system health or the system change, not just the direct outcomes of what we do. So say, for example, that FIT is producing reports, the activity is to write the report. And maybe the outcome is to influence the stakeholders in the peace process, for example. But in a systems approach, there's much deeper work that you're trying to do because the behavior of the peace process stakeholders is only one part of the system. So you're looking at much deeper kind of change. And this means that the impacts of our work are mostly indirect. You're not going to change everything in Colombia by one thing that you do, but you can have many indirect impacts. This means that you have to measure it in different ways. For example, you can't have quantitative evidence of direct impact on the whole population. For example, you could not say that there has been less violence in Colombia and say this is because of what we did in FIP, right? It's just you have what we call in M&E and L an attribution problem. It's very hard to say why there was a reduction in violence. It could be many different causes. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. But you can measure key dynamics, ripple effects, spread, and systemic change. So these are terms, concepts from systems practice that I'm going to explain for you that are really important and different in this approach. And I want to show you that mixed methods are needed to understand these different types of effects, and that if you wanted to do it, it would cost more than traditional M&E. But the advantage is two things. It enables you to have information in real time that helps you to be adaptive. So for example, yesterday or the day before, Gaviota and myself and Tatiana were talking about the Business and Reconciliation Lab's work. And they want to have 3 times during their project to reflect on the methodology, to consider the data, and to change their approach. Now, this is more time consuming, but it means that they can be more effective in what they are doing because they are using their learning in real time. The second advantage is that if you change your approach and if you use learning really well during your project, normally your project gets much better as you move through it, and so you can be more effective. Okay, so some definitions that are important for understanding evaluation from a systems perspective. Now, actividades, I think you understand. It's the work that you do. The outcomes, ¿cómo se dice en español outcomes?
Resultados.
Resultados. Okay, so the results from your work, the things that you want to achieve, your goals. But then in systems, you have different types of change you want to see. One we call key dynamics. So if you think about a systems map, there are some really important loops that you might want to change. You might want to strengthen a positive loop, make it stronger, or weaken a negative loop, or create a new one, or shorten a time delay, the amount of time it takes for something to happen in the system. So this is quite different from traditional M&E because you're talking about something that is non-linear. It's quite a different approach. Another term is ripple effects. Now, ripple is like when you throw a stone into a lake and you see the small waves that spread on the lake, right? That is a ripple. So what this means in a system is that you do something and it has a cascade, or it has a impact upon another part of the system, and that impact then moves to other places. And it takes time, right? But if you can imagine, every time there's something like an election, it has many ripple effects in the system. It has many, many changes. Another concept that is important is spread. Now, spread is a bit different. Spread just means that we did something in one geographic area of the country or with one group of people, and it spread to another group without us doing anything. So for example, if you start using a dialogue practice in Buenaventura, and then 2 years later, there's another group that is using the same dialogue practice, that is spread. That's an example of a systemic change. Now, the final one that we want to measure is system change. Now, system change is very difficult, and it's very deep, and it's very long term. So in my country, for example, there is racism. Now, to change the racism against our indigenous people, it will take a long time. But eventually, we want to see a country that does not have that racism. So that's an example of a system change. In the case of Colombia, it might be a future world, a future Colombia, where disagreements are solved non-violently, without violence. So I just want to use an example from Business and Reconciliation Labs, and maybe Gaviota, you can explain a little bit more. But when we talked about 2 days ago, we talked about their theory of change. Their theory of change was we want to build trust between communities, businesses, and local government, so that there will be more collaboration between them. So then they will have better relationships. And then after better relationships, I don't know what the system change is, but maybe it's peace or reduction in violence. So I want to show how this is an outcome from the project. More trust. And then this is a ripple effect. If they have more trust, they collaborate more. And this is another ripple effect. So you are seeing in the theory of change, you already have a systemic theory of change, or the beginning of a leverage hypothesis. Okay.
Stephen, I have.
Sure.
First is how many times is necessary to measure after a project is finished? Because if there is more time, the results are gonna be related with many other reasons. I don't know. And the second is how in the same line is how certainty we have that our or our actions are actually making those results that we are looking in the system. Because if we think in system, the results is connected with many reasons, many actors, many, I don't know. So those I have a question and a comment. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good question. I really like it. This slide here shows you that we are talking for systems change, a very long-term process. So in the first, normally projects take for 1 or 2 years, right? And so you can look at outcomes and you can measure them sometimes during the course of your project, and then maybe at the end you summarize and do a report. But if you are doing 3 or 4 or 5 projects that have similar goals, they are working towards this, you can start over 2 to 3 to 5 to 10 years to think about, are we having impact on ripple, spread, and key dynamics? Are we changing some of the underlying problems in Colombia? Do you understand? That would be something that's over much more time. And then at 10 years, you could look back and say, have we had an impact here? Now, I want to show you another slide. If you look at this one, when you start one project, you're mostly looking at outcomes, right? And you might look at, in this case, some evidence that what you're trying to do is working, okay? But then as we go down this intervention logic, over time, like after some years, you start asking different questions and you start to try to see if you're having the impact that you expect to see here, or impact on second and third order effects in other places of the system, right? So I guess a couple of responses to your question is, in terms of how often you do it, well, it can be more often during your project, but what I really want you to understand as well is it's a much more long-term vision of change. So it's about how your projects add up over time to having much deeper impact. Does that make sense? I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes. But again, the problem, I think, is that there is no certainty that maybe change in long term are related with things that maybe a
Right.
project that is also a long-term vision is producing. That's something I think about this discussion.
Right.
Yeah.
No, sorry, I didn't answer that. So let me just say, if we look at this, there's an intervention logic here, right? And for each, this is like 1, 2 years, and then this is like 3 to 5 years, and this is even longer. And for each level of change, you have an expectation about what you will see, right? So you can get like some kind of proof, some kind of evidence that this is leading to this, and this is leading to this, or not, and this is leading to this, etc., and then this is leading to this. If you can show that evidence that at every level your hypothesis is true, then you can show the causal pathway or the attribution, which shows that your hypothesis was correct. Now, in reality, the hypothesis is never correct, but it will change from year to year, and you will adjust it to show based upon what is working and what is not to get to the next stage. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I want to say, I think in the traditional way, and according with Daniel, we used to use the counterfactual, that is like kind of twin of the person of the town that we are texting, that we are treatment. Yeah. So I in this new methodology, which is our twin, which is the counterfactual person of town that we are using to compare us. Because as I understand you, we need some studies or research that told us if the activities produce outcomes, but the evidence used to be a quantitative and a traditional way of measure the impacts. So we are using a new methodology, and maybe it's because I don't know too much about systems, but we are using a new methodology, but we are using the older methodologies to see if an activity is working to improve the outcomes or to have a new outcomes. That makes sense? What I say?
Yeah, it does. It does. And so you're saying that you also measure the counterfactual. Like, can you give me an example?
Yeah. Okay. For example, if we want to see if the substitution crops is working, we can take the treatment municipalities, which is the municipalities that are implementing the policy, And then we take the other municipalities that have illicit crops, but you are not treating them. So the counterfactual will be the municipalities that don't have the policy that I'm talking about. And the treatment, so is the municipalities that you choose to do the policy. So for example, in 4 years, if we see that the municipalities that we choose for implement the policy decrease the illicit crops, for example, then the policy have an effect, and we can say that for the policies that we implement have a related effect with the decreasing of the illicit crops in comparison. Yeah, I apologize if I make some mistakes, but I'm trying to explain it the best that I can.
No, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. And I think that helps you with what we call the attribution problem, right? Because you can say our programs caused that change because you're also measuring the counterfactual. And if there's no change in the other situation, then you can be confident that it's because of what you did. And I think that approach it's consistent with what we are doing here in the systems approach. It's just the systems approach is about going beyond the first outcome and looking at the systemic impacts over time. So you could use a counterfactual approach to look at spread, for example, because you could look at another community that started to use the same dialogue process that you used before. And you can see, is that because they had some learning or some relationship with the people that we worked with, or did they find it from another source? Now, if they found it from another source, then it has nothing to do with your work. So that is the counterfactual example. So I think it's a makes your process more robust, more rigorous.
Okay.
Okay. So this slide is just again to explain the difference in systems practice, how you're trying to measure impacts, not just at the level of the work that you do, but how that spreads throughout the system. So the first one is the spread, which I talked about, how that relates to the work of other stakeholders, how they adopt or incorporate good practices. And the other one is ripple effects, like how does the change that you want to see affect second and third order effects that are really valuable. For example, if you have a program about civic participation in politics, does that lead to public policy that is more responsive to the needs of people? And does that lead to more trust in the government and better services for people in the territories, for example? We looked at this slide a little bit already, and it explains a similar thing. Just how when we're looking at systems change, we are looking at a much longer time horizon, and we're also looking at an expanded, more space. By that I mean we're looking for impact beyond the area where you work, the geographic area, the location, and beyond the first cause. So we're looking for the impact to flow throughout the system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is returning to the example that we discussed about the transforming peace building example from Humanity United. And again, this is their intervention logic. This shows their first, second, third order effects that they expect to see within 5 years. But I want to focus on this example of responding to risk to give you more detail about how they would measure this and what indicators and sources of information they use. So if you look at the right-hand side in this area here, it talks about their leverage hypothesis, which some of you are familiar with from the systems work we have done already. And it talks about, I won't read it all, but just to say that it says what the key dynamic is that they're trying to work on. They're trying to strengthen a positive loop. So this is the positive loop here. And what it means is that every time there's a crisis, like a new conflict or a lot of displacement of people, something that gets a lot of international attention, then a lot of organizations say, never again. Maybe you've heard that expression, never again after Rwanda, never again after Darfur. We should not let these crises happen. And there's then always a push to understand risk. Like, how can we understand the situations before they become a large conflict? There's a understanding that there's a short time in which we need to take action, and some organizations become very responsive to raising the, making a warning about those situations. So this is the loop that Humanity United is trying to strengthen, and they do that by investing in organizations like the US Atrocities Prevention Board and many other organizations that try to highlight dangerous situations around the world. They have a theory of change that says by promoting better understanding of the risk of violent conflict, we can increase the window of opportunity for action. That just means we can increase the potential and the time people have to stop the conflicts from happening, which will improve conflict prevention. So these are ripple effects throughout the system. Okay, where am I now? All right, so what I want to show you now is how this looks like from a perspective of how they measure the change that they want to see. So the first area, can you read this at all, or is it too small?
We can.
Okay. So their activity in this area is to support so-called risk innovators, people who are trying to understand and respond to the risk of conflict rather than react to crisis. So they have a program that does that with different organizations. Then the outcome that they expect to see is that within 1 or 2 years, it will lead to better understanding of risks, better analysis tools that increase the time to take action before a crisis, right? That's the outcome. That's pretty traditional for monitoring and evaluation. The key dynamic that they want to affect is in the map that we just saw, and it's more effective engagements which attract more an attention and investment to this type of effort. So they want to see demonstrating the success of this new approach. They want other donors to invest in it. They want more international attention. They want to strengthen this bright spot, this opportunity. the ripple effect that they expect to see, so the other area of the map that they want it to affect, is it will weaken the prediction, not prevention loop. And it's supposed to mean that that will weaken the tendency, the situation where people can understand that there's a problem that's going to happen, but not do anything about it. If there's more evidence, if there's more advocacy, if there's more attention about a crisis that's going to happen, people are more likely to do something about it beforehand. And then the systemic change is that key actors in the peace-building system, so like the United Nations, governments, world leaders, they start to seek approaches that do not just, that lead the world to focus on conflict prevention more than reacting to crisis. And if you've followed at all the UN agenda now on sustaining peace, they focus now on conflict prevention rather than humanitarian response. So just a couple more things. I want to talk about how they measure that. But first, here's where they show the assumptions. Because like I said, the hypothesis is always wrong. You have to test and develop it over time. So in this column, they're clear about all of their assumptions at each stage. And they're clear about the questions that they have to ask to understand if their hypothesis is correct. So these are the questions that they would use at each stage of the monitoring and evaluation. So maybe they would have an evaluation every 1 or 2 years to understand their progress. And finally, this is the assessment methods and indicators that they would use. So at the start, it's quite traditional. It's like the number of identified risk leaders and how many grants that they gave out and what activities were completed. But then it starts to get more systemic. It starts to look at the relationships that, or the second order impacts of that work. So how is it being incorporated into new global policies? How is it influencing global funding? And it continues down like that. So it's starting with like multiple year or evaluations or reporting over multiple years that show the impact that has been had. So I think that you can see that this is a very long-term approach and that it is quite a big change, I think, from probably the type of things that you do now. Would that be correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have some questions or comments, Stephen.
Sure.
Okay. From my point of view, this is not a new technique for monitoring or evaluation, but a different approach to the whole thing, like as the system approach usually is. What we have here is you can use different existing techniques for evaluation, but you have to use them in a more long term, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then my question, or one question could be, okay, in this framework, different actions or projects can contribute to the same expected ripple effects or system spread or system change, right?
Yeah.
So it will have sense to understand that maybe you are not monitoring a particular project, but a whole initiative, right? and how do you manage that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I'll try to answer that. Right. So here you can see that in systems, this approach that I'm talking about, the methods that you're using are not that different. Sometimes they are, like outcome harvesting or assessing multiple capitals, but normally it's quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods. But what you are measuring is quite different because you're looking at indirect impacts, and the timeline is very different as well because you're thinking about a much more longer term process. I'm going to try to draw something, if I can find the whiteboard. Let me see. Okay. Can you see the whiteboard? Oh, good. Okay, I haven't used this before, so let's see what happens. So if you have different programs, business and reconciliation labs, free prior and informed consent project, and many others, maybe at the top somewhere here is FIP's vision. It is your goal. What are you trying to achieve? And at the levels between the goal and the projects, each project has specific goals, but you're hoping that they are contributing to some changes in some key areas. And from a systems perspective, you might say these are key dynamics, or these are ripple effects. And then maybe you want to influence what you believe is the core deep structure of the system in Colombia. So you want to see something like this. And then over time, you're hoping that you're going to have these kind of impacts. It is called cumulative impact. So how are all the projects that you're doing consistent with this goal? And what changes do you expect to see after 3 years and then 5 years? Now my pen has stopped working. Yeah. And then 10 years. So that becomes a question of strategy for the organization. Where do we want to be in 3 years? Where do we want to be in 5 years? And how is what we are doing adding up or contributing to those longer term goals? And I would say that very few organizations have that a strategy that is that coherent. And it's very difficult because donors are always saying, we want you to do this, or we want you to do that. And sometimes you have to follow the money, right? And that's what the FIP Evolution Group found, and that's quite normal. So in a perfect world, we can do whatever we want to contribute to our long-term goals, but it's not always so easy. Okay.
Another question.
Sure.
What if you found that one of the projects you made in the past did not contribute to your ultimate goals, or exact. What kind of measure of yes, what if you found through this kind of evaluation that something that you did in the past did not contribute to the goal you were expecting, or even has um, yes, sino negativo, por ejemplo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's another really good question. I think it's very hard for many organizations to be honest with their evaluations, right? Because we always want more money, and we don't want to tell the people that give us money that we failed. But from a systems perspective, failure is important, because failure means that you learn something. You learn about what didn't work, or even worse, what has a negative impact. And you use that learning to change your approach and to inform other stakeholders. But it's quite difficult, right? You don't want to have a conference and stand on the stage and say, our results showed that we caused huge problems all around the country and had no impact. So it's hard to do. But the systems approach would say that in complexity, no one really knows the best way. So you need to have experimentation, and you need to have a bit of failure sometimes. Okay. So I'm almost finished. I will just show you the end. One thing to notice here, that systems change takes a long time. So it starts slowly, and then it tends to take off much more quickly. So when you're tracking change over time, it's difficult with your relationships with the donor, because you are measuring indicators of deeper change, and they take longer. So you need to have a lot of trust with the donor. This is the final page. This is all of the stuff that so many things that I'm trying to learn about in this field as well. But here are a lot of resources if you're interested to learn more. This one here is a guy that lives in New Zealand, in my country. And it's a funny story, because I went on his website, and he lives in a very strange house in the city that I'm from. It's like a big castle. And I was so surprised to hear he lived in that house. And then he uses systems concepts in evaluation, and they're translated into Spanish. So maybe that one is just like a crazy coincidence, a crazy luck, I guess. So that resource might be interesting to read. Then I think some of these papers, I know these people, and these are quite relevant for conflict. So you might be interested to look at those ones there, and they're a little bit shorter. These ones are much longer books with many different methodologies. One that is quite different that we haven't talked about is called outcome harvesting. And outcome harvesting is interesting because it doesn't set at the beginning the outcomes that you expect to have. It measures, as you implement the project, what outcomes you are having, and then shows how that's related to your work. So it's much better for complex situations. So thank you. I hope that was useful. I know that there's a lot of new concepts, but I hope you found some of that useful.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, Stephen. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome.
So see you in our next community practice. We were very glad that you could share all your knowledge with us. And in case we have other doubts, we will write to you.
Creo que es porque es que están pagados por-
Thank you for sharing with us your knowledge. It was very interesting and we learned a lot from this session. In case we have other doubts, we will write to you, but I think you answered all the questions we have for the moment. So thank you very much. We were very happy to see you again.
You're welcome. Thank you. Can I ask, I could recommend some topics that might be quite interesting. Do any of you do conflict assessment?
Sí,
Evaluación de conflicto.
pensando como en quienes ya no hacen parte del conflicto, o sea, no en el conflicto activo, sino quienes ya no hacen parte del conflicto.
¿Como mediadores?
Sí.
Mediación? Is it like mediation or?
It's like conflict assessment, like if you want to understand why people are fighting, like root cause, conflict drivers, that kind of stuff. Conflict assessment. The systems approach to conflict assessment is really interesting. And I've done a lot of that before. Rob Resigliano has done a lot of work on this as well. It's a really useful way to understand why conflict gets stuck, like why you have these complex dynamics and that leads people to fight. It's an assessment methodology. It's really good. So we could have a session on that.
I think that will be very interesting because I think, well, we have a specific area that works with that. However, in like each of our projects has like this part where we read the context and we understand the conflict we are approaching. So I think this this topic will be very interesting for our colleagues.
Okay. And there's another one which is about like actor mapping, how to understand relationships between stakeholders, differences in power and interests, which is quite useful for if you want to try to improve relationships between people for peace building. So we could maybe combine those methods together.
¿Les suena bien? A mí me
Uy,
suena
sí,
que
el de mapping me parece
de mapping
súper
también.
chévere, súper, especialmente el de mapping pensando en lo de las mesas y esas cosas que nosotros también estamos buscando actores clave.
Sí, nosotros solemos también usar metodologías de mapeo, pero no tenemos como una, pues cada equipo
Sí,
usa su
total.
propia metodología.
Sí, sí, sí.
Sería muy interesante. I like
Okay. Bueno.
it. Good.
Okay. Nice to see you all and buen día y disfruta su fin de semana. Bye for now. Nos vemos pronto.
Ciao, Stephen.
Okay. Yeah, I will. I'll send you some pictures. Okay, bye.
Ay,